welcome everyone to another week of Ramban on HaTorah. We're still in the midst of a horrific war, and our learning is still dedicated to the swift victory and to the release of the hostages and to the refuah shlema for those who are injured. Okay, 304 fascinating Rambans today. There is no theme. I'm sorry for that. It's like an eclectic group. But each of the Rambans is really, really important. Let's start at the very beginning of the parsha, or even before. The parsha starts, Vayeshev Yaakov be'eretz migurei aviv be'eretz Canaan. But what's really going to bother the Ramban is, why doesn't the parsha start with the next pasuk? Eila toldot Yaakov, Yosef ben Shvas, right? All, we've had these before. Eila toldot Yitzchak, even Eila toldot Avram, right? What's wrong with starting from Eila toldot Yaakov? Why the need for the first pasuk? And here the Ramban is going to point us to, even before we see it, the end of last week's parsha starts the last parak in last week's parsha starts Ve'ela toldot Esav hu Adom, which makes complete sense, right? And then the last pasuk of last week's parsha says Aluf Magdiel Aluf Iram Ela Alufe Adom Lemoshivotam Be'eretz Achuzatam hu Esav Achi Adom Avi Adom. And the Ramban is going to point out the difference between Eila Alufei Edom Lemoshivotam and Vayeshev Yaakov be'eretz Migurei Aviv. Says the Ramban, Ki Amar She'alufei Esav Yashvu be'eretz Achuzatam. The previous pasuk had told us that the children of Esav sat be'eretz Achuzatam. Eretz Achuzatam means their permanent home, the land they're going to live in forever. Kilomar, haaretz shelakhu lahem la'achuzat olam. This is their inheritance. Esav has chosen to live in Eretz Edom. Aval Yaakov yashav ger ke'aviv be'eretz lo lahem ela likinaan. But Yaakov chose not to live in Eretz Achuzatam. Yaakov chose to live be'eretz migurei aviv. As Avraham said, ger v'toshav anochi imachem. As Yitzchak saw himself as being a ger. It's true. It's the land that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to give to us. But it's not the land that he's already given to us, because the sin of Canaan hasn't been filled. And so it's not yet our home. So Yaakov lived in the land as a stranger. V'hakavana lahagid ki hein bocharim lagur be'eretz hanivcheret Vishenit kayem bahem ki ger yihye zaracha be'eretz lo lahem v'lo be'esav ki bi'Yaakov levado yikare lahem zara. We think to ourselves from time to time, or all the time, that, okay, Yaakov stole the brachos, or however you're going to describe it, and that's the end of the story. But it's not the end of the story, because the brachos have two parts. Right? You're going to get Eretz Yisrael, but how are you going to get Eretz Yisrael? First, bris ben absarim, va'avadum v'inu otam arba me'ot shana. And you think to yourself, well, in the sweep of history, thousands of years later, how much is 400 years? But at the time, 400 years was real. And even if they only spent 210 years in Eretz Mitzrayim, 210 years is real. I personally don't plan to live 210 years. It's my whole life. It's the whole life of my children. And so the Ramban is saying that Esav not only didn't get the bracha, but he rejected the bris ben absarim. It's my understanding, I think the Ramban thinks so also, that they all knew the bris ben absarim. It had to be that Avram told Yitzchak, it had to be that Yitzchak told Yaakov. And the child, Yaakov, who is going to be called Zara, Ki bi Yitzchak yikare Zara, says the Gemara, bi Yitzchak v'lo kol Yitzchak, right? And the same thing for Yaakov. A part of Yaakov, but not all of Yaakov. So Esav could have claimed part of the bracha had he stayed in Eretz Yisrael. But at that point, Esav said, I'm not interested in ger yazarcha be'eretz lo lahem. I'm going to move to my own land. And when the pasuk says that Yaakov lived be'eretz migurei aviv, says the Ramban, the real chiddush of Be'eretz Migurei Aviv is that he lived as a ger in a land that wasn't his, and he did so to sort of emphasize his claim. that after they go to Mitzrayim and after they fulfill the pasuk of Kiger Yezarcha Be'eretz Lo Lahem, right? Then they come home and Eretz Canaan becomes Eretz Moshvotam, becomes Eretz Achuzatam, becomes the land that was promised to them and the land that Yaakov's children would live in forever. Okay, so the first pasuk of the parsha is not just to throw in Vayeshev Yaakov Eretz Migurei Aviv Eretz Canaan. For the Ramban, it's not just to throw in. It's to contrast it with the previous parsha. It's contrasted Ve'ela Toldot Esav, who chose as Eretz Achuzatam another land. Yaakov, in comparison to that, chose Eretz Yisrael to be the land that he and his children remained in and lived in. And nevertheless, that was Eretz Megurehem. That was the land of Gerut. When they came back, it was then that it became the land that they belonged in. What's interesting is that, we know that the Medrash says, or the Gemara says, that Yitzchak was not allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael, right? But it wasn't really because Eretz Yisrael at that time was the Eretz HaNivcheret. On some level, it must be that it's the Eretz HaNivcheret. But the Ramban says, Yitzchak, right? We think that if we learn the pasuk literally, that it starts from the birth of Yitzchak, right? So Yitzchak had to live in Eretz Yisrael as a ger, even though we think that Yitzchak as an Ola Tmima had to live in Eretz Yisrael because he was too holy to live in Chutz La'aretz. Both things could be true at the same time, right? It was going to be the Eretz HaNivcheret, so at some point in potential it was the Eretz HaNivcheret, but he lived there as a ger, and all of his problems with Avimelech and other people were because he was living there as a ger. Okay, I think that's a fascinating Ramban, and one that is not well enough known. Pasuk Bet in our parsha, a separate but fascinating idea. What was the dynamic of the house of Yaakov? Right, he had 11 sons, then he had 12 sons. What was the relationship like? So the pasuk says, Eile toledot Yaakov, Yosef ben 17 shana haya ro'eh et achav batzon, v'hu na'ar et b'nei vilha ve'et b'nei zilpa neshei aviv, vayoveh Yosef et dibatam ra'ah el avihem. And the Ramban's going to try to figure out, A, what it means, v'hu na'ar et b'nei bilha ve'et b'nei zilpa neshei aviv, and related to that is, who is the subject of vayoveh Yosef et dibatam ra'ah el avihem? Who's diba ra'ah? About who did Yosef HaTzadik, although maybe not at this point, speak Lashon Hara? So says the Ramban, V'hu na'ar et b'nei bilha, shehaya, so this is Rashi, shehaya osen ma'asen na'arut, he acted immaturely, memashmesh be'einav, umitaken b'sa'aro, he played with his hair, he fixed his eyes, maybe wore some kind of makeup, I don't know, all to make him beautiful. And et b'nei bilha, says Rashi, klomar, v'ragil et b'nei bilha, lefi shahayu achav mevazin otan, v'hu mekarvan. Rashi says, no, he was friends with b'nei bilha and b'nei zilpa. With those 4 sons, he was friends, because b'nei Leah mistreated them, and Yosef treated them well. And et dibatam ra'ah, kol ra'ah shaya ra'ah be'achav b'nei Leah, hayam magid la'aviv. That's Rashi. Okay, so according to Rashi, he's best friends with the B'nai Bilha and the B'nai Zilpa, and the Diba that he told to his father was Diba related to the B'nai Leah, not related to the B'nai Zilpa and the B'nai Bilha. That's Rashi. Says the Ramban, The Ramban says, V'im kain, lama lo hitzilu b'nei shefachot, shehaya ohevotam, umekarvan. Right? If that were the case, when the B'nai Leah said, let's sell Yosef, why didn't the B'nai Shfachot say, don't, we love him? Umagid la'aviv al ha'achav b'bizyonam. Right? And he told his father that the B'nai Leah were mistreating the B'nai Bilha and the B'nai Zilpa. It doesn't make sense, says the Ramban. V'im nomar sheyiru min ha'achim. And if we're going to say, well, the B'nai Leah were the big guys, and they were the older brothers, and the B'nai Shfachot were afraid of them, Hine Haim Dalid, there are 4 of them. V'Reuven imahem, and Reuven, the oldest son, already staked out his position that he didn't want to kill Yosef. V'Yosef atzmo, that's 6. That's 6 again, 5. V'Tigbar yadam alehem, and the 6 should beat the 5. And the Ramban points out the obvious. V'Af kilo yavo imahem b'milchama. Right? There's not going to be a civil war amongst brothers. The brothers would have just said, okay, you don't want to sell Yosef. You're going to tell our father if we do it. We're not going to do it. Va'od ki nireh b'katuv ki kulam hiskimu b'mechirato. Certainly the pshat and the psukim seems to be that they were all in on the idea. They all had this idea and they all were in favor of selling Yosef. So what's going on? What's pshat and the psukim? I'm skipping a little in the Ramban, and the Ramban says, Va'amar, ki hu na'ar, v'hu im b'nei bilha v'im b'nei zilpa neshei aviv tamid. He did spend all of his time with the b'nei bilha, the b'nei zilpa. Lo yipared mehem ba'avur na'aruto. So the Ramban says, okay, he had to stick with them because he was young. Ki lahem tziva avihem sheyishmeruhu v'yishartuhu lo livnei hagvirot. Yaakov Avinu told the Bnei Bilha and the Bnei Zilpah that they had to take care of Yosef. For obvious reasons, he didn't want to tell the Bnei Leah that they had to take care of Yosef. There was obviously tension. There was a lot of tension. So fine. So the first part of the pasuk, V'hu na'aret Bnei Bilha v'Bnei Zilpah, has nothing to do with them liking each other. It has to do with that was their job. In addition, says the Ramban, V'hu mevi mehem dibara el avihem. And the dibara that Yosef brought to his father, it was about the Bnei Bilha and the Bnei Zilpah, because they spent all their time together. V'lachein yisnu eila ha'arba'a ha'achim. So these four children, the Bnei Shvachot, hated Yosef because he spoke Lashon Hara about them. Now, just as an aside, you say to yourself, this is Yosef HaTzadik. So I'll just point out to you, I think there is no personality in Sefer Bereshis that went through more of a transformation than Yosef. And I think at this point, the Ramban really does think he was immature, right? He got all his brothers to hate him. Va'achar kein amar ki aviv ahivo. Then the pasuk says that Yaakov loved Yosef the most. Vayiru echav ha'acherim ki oto ahav avihem yoter mikulam vayikanu bo vayisnuhu. Then the other sons, the Bnei Leah, saw that Yaakov Avinu loved Yosef best, and that made them jealous. They were the children of a real wife. Why should Yaakov love Yosef best? So they hated him. Nimtza sanu mikulam. Right? The Bnei Leah hated him because Yaakov loved him. The Bnei Ashvachos hated him because he brought Diba el Avihem. He talked Lashon Hara about them. Bnei Agvirot yikanu bo l'ma'an yehavoto mehem vehem bnei Gvira kamohu. They were jealous. Ubnei Ashvachot asher lo yikanu bazeh l'ma'alato alehem. The Bnei Ashvachot knew that Yosef had a higher standing than them, so they weren't jealous of him. But yisneu bo ba'avur heyoto mevi dibatam el Avihem. But they hated him because he spoke Lashon Hara about him. So unlike Rashi, who thinks four of the children loved Yosef, the Ramban thinks it's not true. The Ramban thinks Yosef spent his time with the Bnei Bilha, the Bnei Zilpah, because his father required it. But at the end of the day, that led him to speak Lashon Hara about them, and the other brothers hated him because Yaakov favored him. So basically, there was no one who loved Yosef, or said another way, they all hated Yosef, and that's how the Mechirah came to be, and that's why no one stood up for him. Okay. One more. Let's try to make some progress. Okay. One more, I think, interesting Ramban. It's interesting because the Ramban touches on a fundamental issue of God's hanhaga of the olam, God's divine providence. Obviously, we have Bechira Chavshis, but this is a problem that comes up from time to time in the Ramban, and it's part of the psukim that they're not really necessary for the story, right? Yaakov sends Yosef to find the brothers. Okay, that's a big question, why Yaakov did that, if he knew that the brothers hated Yosef. But then you find the pasuk. Vayimtsaeu ish v'hinei toeh basadeh, vayishaleo ha'ish lemor ma tevakesh, vayomer et achai anochim bevakesh, right? It's a beautiful song, not really so meaningful in this context, because Yosef and his brothers did not like each other. But Hagida nali eifo heim roim. What's the story with this man? Right? He meets a man, and the man puts him back on the track. Vayimtsaeu ish. So says the Ramban, Yomar kihu to'eh min haderech v'lo haya yodeh ana yelech. Okay, the first thing is Yosef is lost. That seems obvious in the psukim. V'nichnas basadeh, he's looking in the fields. Why? Ki b'makom hamireh hayom mevakesh otam. Where would you bring sheep to graze if not in a field? Now, v'ya'arich hakatuv bazeh. The Torah takes the time to tell us this little interlude and an encounter between Yosef and the Ish, which is unnecessary for the story. Ki sibot ra'ot ba'u elav shehaya ra'ui lachzor lo. Says the Ramban, you have to acknowledge the following. Yosef's doing a great thing now. Yosef's listening to his father, even though he knows that the brothers hate him. Aval hakol sava lichvod aviv. Okay, maybe Yosef's growing up now. Ulahodienu od, this is the bigger point I want to make. Ulahodienu od, ki hagizera emet v'hacharitzut sheker. So Chevelle says this is a phrase from some pasuk, but what it means is the gzeira emet, what God wants is going to happen, v'hacharitzut sheker, and human intervention and human activity, that's not going to last. Ki zimein lo hakadosh baruch hu mored derech shelo mida'ato lahavio biyadam. Right? Yosef is listening to his father, despite the fact that he needs to be nervous about it because his brothers hate him. And he goes to find his brothers and he can't find them. And he's actually searching instead of just giving up and saying, well, I went, they weren't there. I went to Shechem, they weren't there, so I came home. No, HaKadosh Baruch Hu sends an Ish to tell him, Ki zimein lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu mored derech shelo midato. He didn't know it was a malach, lahavi biyadam, because he needed to land up with his brothers and he needed to be sold to Mitzrayim so that the whole story could take place. Ulizen nitkavnu rabotenu ba'amram ki ha'ishim ha'ele hey malachim. Right? Why would Chazal start interpreting the pasuk shelo kipshuto that this person was Gavriel and he was a malach? The answer is because it's unnecessary to the story and because there's something else going on. Shelo al chinam haya kol asipur hazeh, because the Torah is not telling us a story for no purpose. Lahodienu ki atzat Hashem hi takum. The point of the story is simple. Sometimes HaKadosh Baruch Hu leaves things up to us, and sometimes HaKadosh Baruch Hu is forced to intervene. Right? At that point in history, the most important thing that had to happen was that Yosef needed to go to Mitzrayim so that eventually Yaakov and his sons would follow him to Mitzrayim. And says the Ramban, that had to happen no matter what. So if it was going to happen naturally, and if Yosef, this is how I understand it, if Yosef was going to go to Shechem and find his brothers, fine. They would have sold him then, and the story would have taken place. But Yosef went to Shechem, and his brothers weren't there. So there was a risk at that point. He really looked. He looked as hard as he could. There was a risk that he'd have to give up and go home. And then what would happen to the Bris Ben Absarim? And what would happen to Ki Ger Yazarcha Be'etz Lo Lohem? So says the Ramban, sometimes HaKadosh Baruch Hu intervenes in human history. And he does it by way of an Ish. Right? You could read these psukim as, okay, it's a coincidence. He was lost. He found somebody. This somebody happened to know where the brothers were, and so he sent him on his way. But Chazal say that's not what happened. This somebody is a malach. And the malach was there, ki dvar Hashem emet, ki hagzeira emet, v'haritzut sheker. Because we're not in charge of the world. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is in charge of the world. And sometimes HaKadosh Baruch Hu has to intervene, because he has to make sure that the plan works out. And the plan was that Bnei Yisrael would go to Mitzrayim. Now you could say to me, okay, there are other ways that HaKadosh Baruch Hu could have done it. It's true. But at some point, Yosef had to be sent to Mitzrayim, and his family had to follow him 22 years later. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu decided that this was the point. And so HaKadosh Baruch Hu sent the malach, and the point is sometimes when HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants something to happen, or kiviyachol, sometimes when HaKadosh Baruch Hu needs something to happen, he's going to make it happen. And all of the planning and all of the effort and everything that's to do with human beings, it won't matter. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to make it happen. And in this case, he did, by way of sending the malach. It's true, Yosef had to choose on his own to follow. And Chazal make it clear that when the Malach tells him different things, Nas'u mizeh, and the Medrash says, Nas'u min ha'achva, Yosef didn't understand the conversation at all. If the Malach had said to him, Nas'u min ha'achva, they hate you, Yosef wouldn't have gone to Dotan. The Ramban thinks he wouldn't have gone. But Chazal say the Malach told him they're in Dotan, and the deeper meaning of the Malach's message to Yosef was that your brothers hate you. But it wasn't said in a way that would alarm Yosef, and so he missed that point completely, and he went to Dotan, and there his brothers, threw him in a pit, and eventually he was sold, and the story played out exactly as HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted. Okay, last Ramban. And this is really, it's unrelated to anything, but I find it fascinating, and even if we're not going to fully understand, well, I think we might. Even if we're not, we need to learn this together. Okay, the story of Yehuda and Tamar. Okay, Yehuda has two sons, Er and Onan, and then he has a third son, Shelah, and they both die. And Yehuda says, Vayoma Yehuda la'Onan, this is the second son, Bo el eshet achicha v'yabei mota, v'hakem zera la'achicha. Wait, is Yibum one of the Zayin mitzvahs b'nei Noach? Like, what's the mitzvah of Yibum doing in Sefer Bereshis? Right? This seems highly unusual, but there's a deeper point the Ramban wants to make. So first he quotes Rashi, and this is our general understanding. Habein yikare al shem hamet. He says, okay, when the child is born of the second son, again, the first son died without any children. So the second son is Miyabim Tamar, the wife of the first son. And Rashi says, you have to name the son who's going to be born from the union of the second son with Tamar, you have to name him after the dead son. So in theory, right, the son who would be born would be called Er. Says Ramban, Ve'ein ze'emet, it's not true. Ki b'mitzvat HaTorah ne'emar gam kein yakum al shem achiv hamet v'lo yimachas shemo miYisrael. Torah law, which is not yet, but later on when the mitzvah of Yibum is given, the same pasuk is written, right? Yakum al shem achiv hamet ve'ein hayaba mitzuva likro livno k'shem achiv hamet. Right? But that's not the pshat in the pasuk. Nobody thinks that the din of Yibum requires the Yavam to name the son after the dead brother. V'amar, here's a good example. B'Boaz, v'gam etrut ha'mo'iva eshet machlon kaniti li le'isha la'akem shem hamet al nachlato v'lo yikaret shem hamet me'im echav u'mishar mekamo v'atikrana oto oved v'lo machlon. Right? The pasuk says they named him, that the son was born. It was the union from Yibum, but they didn't name him after the dead brother. Va'od she'amar vayeda onan ki lo yihazara. In addition, the Torah says that Onan did not complete the union with Tamar because he knew that the son would be named after his brother. And says the Ramban, Uma hara'a asher tovo aleh ad ki hishchit zaro mi paneha im yikarei shem beno kishem achiv hameis. What's so bad about naming your son after your brother who died? V'rov b'nei ha'adam mitavim la'asot kain. Right? We want to name children after dead relatives. It's less a thing in Israel than it is in America. But that's generally our feeling. It's an honor to name. God forbid you lost somebody who was important to you, who you loved. You lost your brother. Of course you'd want to name your son after your brother. The Torah goes out of its way to say that Onan did not complete, the act with Tamar because he didn't want to name his son after his brother. Why didn't he? V'lo amar hakatuv vayomer Onan. The Torah doesn't say that Onan said, I'm not going to complete the act with Tamar because then I'm going to have to name my son after my brother. It says, Aval Amar, Vayeda Onan ki lo yihi hazara. He knew, ki lo yihi hazara. What does that mean? That he would not have the child. Says the Ramban, Ki yidiya birura haita lo bazeh shelo yihiya lo hazara. He knew, he had an absolute deep understanding that the child would not be his. What does that mean? Aval ha'inyan sod gadol misodot HaTorah b'toldat ha'adam. He says the explanation for Yibum, and again, this is not the mitzvah of Yibum, this is the concept of Yibum. He said the concept of Yibum is one of the great secrets of the Torah, which I think we can understand on some level. V'nikarhu le'einei ro'im asher natan lohem Hashem einayim lirot v'oznayim lishmoah. And it's clear to anybody with eyes and ears. V'hayu hachachamim hakadmonim kodem HaTorah yodim. And intelligent people, I don't think he means Talmidei Chacham, intelligent people, even before Har Sinai, even before Matan Torah, knew the secret. What is it? Ki yesh to'elet gidola biyibum ha'ach. There's a great benefit when the brother, the next brother in line, marries the widow of the first brother who had no children. Vehu hara'ui lihiyot kodem bo va'acharav akarov v'mishpacha. He should do it first. If he doesn't, another member of the family can do it. Ki kol she'iro hakarov elav v'mishpachto asher hu yoresh nachala yagiu mimenu to'elet. Because anybody in the family will have this benefit. Ve'haya no hagim lisa eshet hameis ha'ach o ha'avo akarov min ha'mishpacha. Okay? Ve'lo yadanu im haya minhag kadmon lifnei Yehuda. The Ramban says, I don't know if Yehuda is the first time this happened in the history of the world, and therefore he's the first person to introduce Yibum, or it happened before, it was well known. But what is it? So the Ramban explains, we won't read it inside, because we're running out of time, but also because it's confusing. The Ramban explains what we would all assume, which is when the second son has a child with the first wife, that son belongs, the father of that son is heir, not Onan. Now, physically, I guess genetically, of course Onan is the father. Er is dead, and he died well before Onan would have had relations with Tamar. But the secret is, in English you would call that transmigrations of souls, something like that. The secret is, on some level, Vayeda Onan ki lo yihiyeh hazara. Onan understood that even if he had relations with Tamar and she gave birth to what was or what should have been physically, genetically his son, it would not really be his son. There's something about how the world works. There's something about how HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world that tells us that a son that's born through Yibum belongs, the real father is the dead father. Nothing to do, like Rashi says, with naming him after. It's much deeper than that. It's literally his son, even though physically it's not his son. Now, I'm going to stop here in terms of trying to explain it, because anything I say will detract from it. That's my basic understanding, beyond that. The bigger question is, what does it mean that Yibum existed before Matan Torah? And then what? Then HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us a mitzvah to continue this tradition, right? Otherwise, right, it's also to marry your wife's, it's also to marry your brother's wife, right? And those people who marry their brother's wives, the Torah gives you a klala, right? You're going to be childless. Later on in Devarim, the Torah gives you the exception. Okay, you'll be childless unless you do it through the mitzvah of Yibum. So I'm raising the issue without answering it. The issue is, did this mitzvah really exist? And then HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, you know what? This is a good mitzvah. I should give it to Klal Yisrael. Right? That would open up the whole possibility that there's more going on in Sefer Bereshis than we normally give it credit for. Right? There are ideas, there are mitzvahs, there are things. We know that Sefer Bereshis really matters. We know more than just Ma'aseh Avot Simun Labanim, or as the Ramban says, Ma'aseh Avot Yitzira Labanim, that it really creates a future and it teaches us how to behave, but maybe even halachically, if not narrowly halachically, the idea that something that happened in Sefer Bereshis was then adopted later by HaKadosh Baruch Hu and put into the Tarag Mitzvos, because it's a concept that really exists and really matters in the Torah. That's a fascinating idea. I think a part of that is true. I don't want to deal with it. I'm just raising it. But we've seen really, really good things today. We saw that the brachos, even though they were taken by Yaakov in the previous parsha, they still need to play out. And one of the reasons we got the bracha is because Yaakov Avinu chose to live be'eretz megureihem, and Esav chose to live be'eretz achuzatam. We also saw the dynamics of the house of Yaakov, that the Bnei Leah, according to Ramban, hated him because they were jealous, and the Bnei Ashvachos hated Yosef because he was mevi dibara al avihem, and in the end, says the Ramban, everybody hated Yosef. We saw that this man was not just a man, he was a malach, and that the point is when HaKadosh Baruch Hu needs to manipulate events to achieve the result that he needs, he will do so. And finally, this fascinating idea of Yibum, a mitzvah that existed in Sefer Bereshis before it ever existed as a mitzvah HaTorah. Okay, that's it for today. Shabbat Shalom, and I'll see you next week. Kol Tov.